And today's speech is on, our presentation is on translation services in the field and beyond. And you'll have about 20 minutes and then 10 minutes for questions at the end. I want to introduce from Seattle Public Utilities, I'm Heidi Zarghami and Erik Lust.
So today we're going to be covering translation services. So this is going to be for in-field staff that are going to be out doing, Seattle Public Utilities and other public utilities types of works. And I found that it was something where I did my own personal setup of this for my team. So I'm going to be covering a case study of how I set this up. And then I'll be turning it over to Erik Lust. He's the Source Control and Pollution Prevention Manager, and he'll be taking a manager's perspective on how to set this up for your own team. I want to start off with why we're doing this, bring it back to the mission. Equity is always really important for us to keep in mind. For Seattle, we've got a really diverse population. We want to make sure that we're providing our services equitably amongst our residents, regardless of their cultural background or preferred language spoken. And it's also about bringing businesses into compliance. And so that starts with understanding. Stormwater code is complicated. We're paid to understand our stormwater codes, and we can have lengthy conversations of what it can mean exactly. And most of us are native English speakers, right? So if you're also expecting somebody that isn't as familiar with all the details of the code and then also has a language barrier, we're supposed to be bridging that gap and providing that technical guidance. And good communication also makes enforcement easier. It's much easier to understand why you're getting a big fine when you understand all the reasons of, why you didn't measure up to the stormwater code and our particular expectations of what they're supposed to be doing. I also had a conversation last night and they said, you should include this. The whole reason why I started this was I had a side sewer overflow that I responded to, and the gentleman was Spanish speaking. He didn't really understand, and we were really struggling, trying to piecemeal what little bits of Spanish we knew and mining out our actions. And he didn't really fully understand, and I tried to bring him some supplemental materials the next day, but I realized I didn't have anybody to call that I knew of, that could help me out in translating that information. And we had a program that could give him a grant to fund the repairs. And so it kind of led me on this journey. How do I set this up for myself and my team? So I'll go over that today. So understanding your communities is the first step. So with the City of Seattle, we already had this work done for us. So knowing what's already available to you is important. We had a whole bit of research that was done where it broke down the different communities throughout the city and the most common languages spoken. So we already knew, all right, these were the languages we're going to have transcreated. These are languages that we understand we're most likely going to encounter, and the neighborhoods that we are likely to encounter them in. So we can have an understanding when we're going out to a call, this may be a chance for us to use our translation services. Checking your available resources. So at Seattle Public Utilities, we had a language access toolkit, and this was put together for us that allowed any team within the City of Seattle to be able to access this information, and included information on Cascadia, the consulting group that could transcreate materials for us, and Language Line Solutions, which was a consulting account that had been set up for the city, and we just needed to create our own particular client ID for the service to be used by our team. I'm going to go over lessons learned of implementing this for the team and doing some training, and what you could implement when you are doing your training for your team, because being prepared is everything, right? Because you don't know when you're going to need a translator. You'll show up, and it's not like you can schedule it ahead of time and do a conference call and have all of your materials ready to go. So having all the translation information in everybody's phone is important. So I like to do, when I do my training with my team, at that moment be like, all right, everyone pull out your phones, and we're going to input the contact ID right now. You're going to put the phone number, and then you usually have a code associated with your account. So you do invoicing later on, depending on the service you choose. So you put in your phone number, a couple of commas, and then your ID. And so that way, when the people have to call it, I like to put it on their favorites or speed dial. They can call it, it pauses, inputs the number, and then they're ready to go, and they can just say what language they need. Keep a translation guide and language identification card either on hand or in any of the vehicles. So I have an example of that. Y'all are welcome to take a look at it afterwards. This is an example of the translation language identification card. So they can just point at the language that they prefer and says it in English and in their own language with a little blurb of, we're with Seattle Public Utilities, we're here to speak with you. A translator will be provided to you at no cost. And then we have Stormwater Code BMP handouts in the 7 most common language spoken, and it's just available at all times. So, and we also have backups, right? We have all this same information online because maybe you already handed that information out, or maybe there's multiple people there that would like it, and you can just pull it up on your work phones, send it off by work email. So that's always really important. It's also kind of difficult to know, like maybe they are following along pretty well and you think they're understanding, but you're not quite sure. It's that not quite sure part that is always interesting, because I call it the mind check. You start like trying to explain what a catch basin is and all these things. You might need a translator. The thing where people would be like, yes, yes, yes. It could also be a way of them saying, continue, go on. I want you to keep talking because of cultural differences. Other people will say, yes, but that might not mean that they completely understand every word that you're saying. So having open-ended questions, that can be a really good way to suss out whether or not that is truly them understanding by saying, you know, how do you dispose of your used cooking oil, instead of you put it in that container, right? And they're like, yeah, definitely, that sounds like the correct answer. And remember, it's always important to get consent, so asking permission, and it's always, you know, a good idea to ask. If you're kind of like unsure, maybe not, they seem to be following, just ask. They can say yes or no, and you can go from there. So things to know before you call. We got enough things to do when we're out in the field, but take a second, jot down the 5 main bullets of why you're calling. Like, what are the actions that they did that, you know, you're responding to? What actions are you asking for them to do? You know, any follow-up types of things that you need, because as soon as you start doing the translation phone call, it gets really like, did I cover that? What did they say about that? Just jot it down. All right, trust me. It can be really busy out there, right? Like sometimes we're next to a Vector truck, sometimes we're next to a Batesy Street, or maybe sometimes, you know, we're in a you know, outreach fair, and there's just a lot of hubbub going on. Take a, you know, step aside. It's already difficult enough having a 3-way conversation in another language. Make sure there's a little bit of quiet space where you can do that. Take it slow. These you know, translation conversations take about twice as long on average, and there's oftentimes questions that kind of come up again and again, which when you say, all right, this is what you need to do. You say, yes, I understand, but also this, and you weren't even done with your second bullet point. So keep in mind that it can be a process. Also, during the phone conversation, there's kind of an ebb and flow to things. So allow introductions for everyone. You can't just launch into it. The translator likes to introduce themselves. How are you today? What is your name? Why are you here? Like, there's a process there. You also have to speak normally. I had to learn this the hard way. The translator needs complete thoughts. You can't just like say, all right, I'm gonna speak and then stop as if you're dictating, give you time to like translate it. No, they need the complete thought, so that way they can translate it appropriately, because it's full thought, not just word for word. Checking in periodically with both the person that you're speaking with in person and the translator over the phone to make sure, because they might need you to reiterate something so that they can translate it properly. And closing the call, depending on the cultural background, there's a process for saying goodbye. And so it might be kind of a roundabout process, and then another question pops up, and it begins all over again. So that's been my experience with setting this up. I'm now going to hand it over to Erik Lust, and he'll be speaking about the logistics of setting this up for your team.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Erik Lust, the manager of the team in Seattle. And my presentation is about how to ask your boss for these kind of customer service features and to get success. So there's, you know, Seattle has a fair bit of money. But my career before Seattle was in a very small community where $1,000 was a huge amount of money. And so one of the things that I'm not maybe great at is getting everything I ask for in the budget approved. But you can do a lot better if you show up with good evidence and good data and good reasoning for what you need, and be able to prove that by doing this, you get more effective outcomes by having better customer service. So considerations for the ask. I think one of the things that's important is distinguishing whether it's a one-time ask or an ongoing ask. So like language services lines are something that's going to incur costs year after year, whereas a single pamphlet is a single year budget ask. And then the other thing is like, what languages do you need? Some languages are really common and they're basically free to do the work on, or at least relatively cheap. You might be able to get more bang for your buck because they're not that hard, so to speak. But the more languages that you ask for, and the more complex sort of things like doing enforcement documents or enforcement letters created, that'll add cost. I always recommend starting by collecting data. In fact, when people are building out their data collection systems, because phase 2s are all coming online, you're probably building out your data collection systems for your new stormwater programs. You may want to consider just including some language information in there at the very get-go, as maybe not every single time, but if you find that you're consistently having language problems in certain types of businesses or other just areas, you can certainly use secondhand information like those census maps that show like, oh, there's languages like this spoken here or there, but we frequently are going into businesses and people don't live where they work. See, there's not anything else on here. So another thing that's on here before I go on, the resource you need may already exist. So like the language line service in Seattle, that was already in place for customer service. We just needed an account to be able to do it. And we needed somebody to take the time to actually set us up and train us on it and all that stuff. Another thing is you could actually like double your benefit for the money that you spend by coming up with something that's needed by others in the city, right? So I think there's some work that can be done to make your argument work better from a budgeting perspective. Another thing too is to show up with at least 2 different options, preferably 3. That way there's some room to adapt or adjust. Like what frequently happens when you go do budget stuff is you say, I need this $5,000 thing. And they say, you're approved, but only for $1,000. And if your project can't be adjusted like that, yeah, it's best to show up with a plan ahead of time. This kind of gets back into using cost as a metric for what you're asking for. I put down some examples of how different costs kind of are, at least in my mind, associated here, but I won't belabor this slide. You guys can easily kind of get that. One of the things I want to do is just kind of reiterate that you can kind of set yourself up for failure. And so I put up some pitfalls here, like failing to plan. So if you just like are out in the field and you have a bad day, you go see your boss and you're like, I need stuff. That's not going to be nearly as effective. The other thing is like using online translators. So you might be out in the field and have an awful day. So you go back home, you're back to work and you look up Google Translate and you put in your code and Google gives you a thing that you can't understand and you go take that. So maybe it'll be right. But another thing is failing to test with community and native speakers. So this is another example where you may be able to get like free help. A lot of times there's just groups out there that they want the information in their language. And like, yes, we should be paying everybody equally and all of that, but the reality is they may just want to volunteer to help. So, and at the very least, you can try out your materials on them. And then the last thing is don't work on things that are not in your work plan, especially if you're going to go ask your boss for something afterwards. and you're like, I spent the last 2 months working on this, and your boss is like, yes, but did you get your NPDS required that first time? Another thing is that budget can take up to 2 years. Like right now, if somebody came to me and said they needed $5,000 for something, I'd tell them it will be 2025 when you'll be seeing that money. So I don't know how every budget is, but that was the way it was at both the places that I worked. Okay. And then a last bullet point on here too is don't set something up failing to set up how to pay for it. So this is more for the ongoing stuff. It's like a single thing that's just a contract. You just set it up and you budget a certain amount of money and do a purchase order and it's done. But ongoing services, especially those that you can't really anticipate when you're going to need them, they can go a little bit of time before you use them, which will cause the people in finance to forget who to send the bill to. So make sure that when you're doing training on them, that is included in your training. One of the things I wanted to do is just kind of throw one to our contract person. Like, we have a great business contract and it's a pretty substantial amount of money. But that's being said, I did get some help on my half of the presentation from Cascadia. And so I told Lynn and Alejandro that I would put a thank you in their slide for them. So this is just a bit of kind of marketing, I guess is the way to put it. Cascadia does have good translation, transcreation services. I think that I list the languages that they have kind of in-house in this slide, but they also are very capable at doing languages that are not on this slide. So keep them in mind, they're good people. And that is the end of our talk, and we can open it up to questions.